Hello, welcome to Book Journey. Today, we're delving into a psychological work aimed at middle-aged individuals, titled The Middle Passage, From Misery to Meaning in Midlife. It carries an intriguing subtitle, The Second Formation of Personality. The term middle passage used in this book is essentially another way to refer to the midlife crisis. Before reading this book, my perception of the term midlife crisis was both familiar and alien. It's a common phrase that seems to require no explanation. When a middle-aged person is anxious about work, marriage, elderly care, or children, or suddenly picks up a hobby from years ago and starts exploring a new lifestyle that doesn't quite fit their past, those around them might summarize their situation with the term midlife crisis. Often, there's a teasing undertone to this term, as if everyone who's experienced it understands it without needing to speak of it, which adds to the mystery of this supposed watershed moment in life. It leaves many questions even for those who've passed through it, such as what psychological mechanisms lie behind midlife crises, why do they occur at the midpoint of our lives, and how can we cope with this predicament that seems universal? In today's book, I've found a set of reference answers to the above questions. The author believes that the term midlife crisis seems somewhat negative and one-sided. He prefers to call this special midlife journey the middle passage, meaning it's not a disaster waiting to be resolved but a path connecting the past and the future. There are indeed challenges along this path, but those who overcome them will usher in a new chapter with broader horizons. During this process of overcoming challenges, we will experience what the author calls the second formation of personality. Our personality completed its first formation when we moved from adolescence to adulthood. However, in the author's view, the personality formed for the first time is immature and incomplete, like milk teeth, and can only be considered a temporary adult personality. Only after the second formation can we truly transform and obtain a more stable and refined personality, and thus find a more reliable sense of meaning in life. Therefore, although the middle passage is full of challenges, from a positive perspective, it is also a necessary trial for us to achieve further growth. This theory of the middle passage is rooted in the teachings of the psychological master Carl Jung. The author, James Hollis, is a renowned Jungian psychologist in the United States, born in 1940. He spent the first half of his life teaching at universities, and later received systematic training at the Jung Institute in Zurich, which was founded by Jung himself, becoming a Jungian analyst. Over the years, Hollis has mainly provided psychological counseling for middle-aged people, accumulating a wealth of cases and experience in solving middle-aged psychological issues, providing rich resources for his writing of this book. Mentioning Jung, you probably know that he is one of the three masters of psychoanalysis, along with his teacher Freud and Adler, the author of the famous The Neurotic Constitution. Jung's teachings integrate psychology, literature, philosophy, and other fields which may seem a bit abstruse at first contact. However, readers who appreciate Jung will be impressed by his profound insights and poetic language. Today's book also has a similar linguistic feature. Next, my interpretation of this book will focus on three questions. First, let's talk about how the first formation of personality occurs and what characteristics this version 1.0 personality has. Next, let's discuss the issue of midlife crisis, see what challenges people face in middle age, and what psychological mechanisms exist behind these challenges. Finally, let's see what suggestions Hollis has made to help us smoothly go through the middle passage. Formation of the temporary personality. Next, let's go back to the early stages of life and look at the first formation of personality. The first formation of personality here roughly corresponds to the process we usually refer to as growing up. It spans the first 2 or 3 decades of our lives. When a person gets rid of the ignorance of adolescence, leaves the family of origin, enters society, and starts to live independently, the first formation of personality is basically completed. We usually regard such people as mature individuals. However, in today's book, the author Hollis calls the personality formed at this stage a temporary adult personality. Why is it temporary? Why is this version 1.0 personality not enough to support us through a complete life? Hollis explains that this version of personality is not formed actively but passively. Rather than being the result of a series of active choices we've made, it is more like a collection of passive reactions to our early experiences and life traumas. If you are familiar with the psychoanalytic school, you will surely notice that scholars in this school pay great attention to the role of childhood experiences, especially trauma, in the formation of personality. A sociologist once said, "Childhood is not the shortest period of our lives, but the longest period, because it accompanies us until our death." Most scholars of the psychoanalytic school would agree with this statement. Regarding childhood experiences, Jung proposed an important concept called the inner child. You can understand it as a figurative metaphor. Within each of us lives an immature self, composed of our memories of childhood traumas. This is not to say that all of us have experienced tragic childhoods, but in the view of psychoanalytic scholars, every person is a vulnerable individual at birth, having just experienced the trauma of separation from the womb. Since then, every time we encounter setbacks and neglect, our inner child remembers the feeling of pain. Even if we now recall our childhood as carefree and joyful, those memories of trauma accumulate in our subconscious, and once touched, they send out stabbing pains. If this fragile and sensitive inner child is all there is to ourself, it's hard to imagine that we could cope with the harsher trials of the adult world. To protect our inner child, each of us has developed a set of strategies to deal with the setbacks in life, and to a large extent, this set of strategies constitutes our version 1.0 personality. It sounds like there's nothing wrong with the process of personality formation. It's like putting on a suit of armor for the vulnerable inner child. However, Hollis and many other psychoanalytic scholars believe that this personality formed in early life is not a real suit of armor. It's more like a scab over a wound, a set of expedient measures we reflexively took after trauma. It has not been thought through by a mature mind, so it's crude and has obvious flaws. For example, Hollis cites this true case in the book, "A Man Always Felt Distant from His Father." It wasn't until he was 37 years old, as his father was dying, that he asked the question that had been on his mind, "Why have we never been close?" His father became very emotional, and recounted many trivial things from his childhood, such as how he had dropped a toy into the toilet, and his father had gone to great lengths to retrieve it. The implication was that their relationship had been good when he was young, and that he had been attentive and taken his son's affairs seriously. The son left the hospital that day feeling incredibly liberated, because he had always felt unworthy of his father's love. It wasn't until his father reminded him of those old memories that he was surprised to find his memories of childhood were incomplete, and he had been unilaterally shaping his relationship with his father based on memories of being neglected. In reality, their relationship was much more complex and rich than he had imagined. This example illustrates the flaws of the version 1.0 personality. To avoid touching on childhood trauma, we sometimes interpret the real world with immature minds, but these interpretations may not conform to the facts and may not be conducive to our long-term development. For the son in the case, his interpretation of his neglected childhood experiences was that he was unworthy of his father's love. This is, of course, a negative conclusion, but at least it made the young him feel that the world around him was understandable, thus obtaining a sense of stability. However, in later life, this sense of unworthiness became a part of his version 1.0 personality. This not only made him unconsciously alienate his father, but also caused obstacles in other interpersonal relationships. The problem with the version 1.0 personality is that it tends to overemphasize memories related to trauma, forming certain radical response patterns in our personality. These patterns did protect our inner child for a while, but they brought new problems to our long journey through adult life. There are many examples like this son, who formed a flawed adult personality due to childhood trauma. For instance, we may become overly dependent on our partners in intimate relationships due to neglect in childhood. Parents' anxiety may be internalized by children as a sense of insecurity in the face of the world. Another common situation is that parents' high expectations for their children may form a negative rebellious sentiment in the child's subconscious. Such children, even if they grow up to be outstanding individuals as their parents hoped, may fall into certain addictions driven by rebellious sentiments. Jung said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of their parents." This is a regrettable situation. Is there a way to correct these personality flaws caused by childhood trauma? According to the founder of psychoanalysis, Freud, such flaws are deeply rooted and difficult to change. But this is one of the most significant differences between Freud and his two students, Jung and Adler. In the view of Jung and Adler, personality is always in a dynamic development process, and our destiny is far from being passively determined by childhood trauma. As long as we consciously review past experiences in adulthood, identify and rewrite those problematic psychological patterns through introspection, we can break through the limitations of childhood and build a more refined personality to replace the temporary personality formed in early life. However, the trouble is that this process of renewal does not occur smoothly in most people, but erupts concentratedly when the midlife crisis arrives. According to the author Hollis, in the first 2 or 3 decades of life, we are just living unconsciously with the traces of past experiences, and when our inner child crosses the hills with us and arrives at the midpoint of life, the shabby armor it wears is suddenly shattered by the pressures of middle age, and at this time, many long-forgotten pains and psychological needs will re-emerge, leaving us at a loss. The psychological mechanism of midlife crisis. Next, let's analyze the psychological mechanism of the midlife crisis in detail. In today's book, the author Hollis summarizes the characteristics of our thinking patterns in childhood, youth, and middle age with 3 words: magical thinking, heroic thinking, and realistic thinking. The midlife crisis arises during the transition from the first 2 types of thinking to the third. In childhood, our primary mode of thinking is magical thinking. What is magical thinking? This term is actually borrowed from anthropology. Anthropologists studying primitive tribes found that people in those tribes always thought that everything in the world revolved around their tribe. The sun, moon, and stars all originated from ancient legends of the ancestors, and wind, frost, rain, and snow all obeyed the arrangements of the priests and sorcerers. There is no clear boundary between the inner spiritual world and the external material world, but they are connected through some mysterious force, that is, magic. This way of thinking, which places the self at the center of the world and believes that everything is related to oneself, is called magical thinking. Similarly, in a child's worldview, the boundary between reality and imagination is often blurred, and the child is immersed in the illusion that the world revolves around them. This illusion is certainly a self-expanding delusion, but it can be healthy and wonderful for children. Think about it, children's imaginations about the future are mostly extremely idealized, such as wanting to be astronauts, scientists, big stars, wanting to be rich, admired, or even change the world. These romantic dreams give children the original driving force to explore the world and make them believe that their lives are destined to be safe and beautiful, which is certainly conducive to the healthy growth of children. However, as age increases, the disadvantages of magical thinking will gradually emerge. Its main problem is that it has an extremely personalized tendency. No matter what children encounter, they will subconsciously think, "All this is arranged for me, it's all about me," which leads to the one-sided understanding of the world we mentioned earlier and the formation of radical personality issues. In addition, magical thinking, after all, has a considerable irrational component and is not enough to truly explain the real world. This determines that it can only accompany us through the initial stage of life. When we get rid of the ignorance of childhood and enter the youth, heroic thinking replaces magical thinking and becomes our dominant way of thinking. The so-called heroic thinking is a way of thinking that describes one's life as a hero's journey. It is more rational and realistic than magical thinking, but it still retains the positive and optimistic components of magical thinking. Young people who have just entered society will no longer naively believe that they are the center of the world like children, but they still firmly believe that they are the protagonists of an uplifting life story. They still look forward to brilliant achievements in the future, which gives them passion and fighting spirit to face the challenges of life. They may have noticed that the lives of some older people around them are not as beautiful as they imagined, but they believe that the failures of their predecessors only provide some lessons for them. As long as they work hard, stay awake, and they will eventually have an ideal career, marriage, and family. It sounds like heroic thinking is a quite positive way of thinking. It has a clear sense of purpose, gives people the energy to act, and allows us to move towards a better life. However, its problem lies in its rigidity and lack of resilience. Those young people who are full of expectations for the future find it difficult to deal with major life changes, and what they find even harder to accept is their inherent limitations. This is not to say that people are destined to fail, but rather refers to those more difficult to avoid or predict limitations, such as the decline of passion in love, the gradual loss of energy with age, after many years of hard work in a certain field, only to suddenly find that the entire industry has entered the evening, once full of passion for a certain hobby, now can't get interested. When more and more of these situations appear in our lives, the heroic thinking is like a speedboat sailing into a sea area full of hidden reefs. The anxiety in the hearts of middle-aged people also accumulates subtly. In the last part, we introduced the temporary personality formed to protect the inner child, and now you can also understand the connection between magical thinking and heroic thinking, and the temporary personality. Simply put, magical thinking weaves the temporary personality, and heroic thinking is the projection of the temporary personality on the real world. However, when we arrive at the midpoint of life, this projection is becoming darker and darker, and the anxiety that is not with us is gradually accumulating into a restless energy, surging under the plate of the temporary personality. When this energy finally erupts, the midlife crisis arrives. How to cross the middle passage? What will happen next? Next, our way of thinking will gradually shift from heroic thinking to realistic thinking. As the name suggests, realistic thinking is a way of thinking that acknowledges and accepts the limitations of reality. When we encounter a midlife crisis, or in other words, when we embark on the middle passage, the reality of life is calling us to view issues from a different perspective than before. The role of realistic thinking is to restore balance, and it can help us adjust our posture to face the surrounding world with a humble attitude. The author Hollis mentions a friend of his in the book. When this friend embarked on the middle passage, a sentence came to his mind: "My life will never be complete." His soul announced to himself that the inflated desires of his youth were ultimately hard to achieve. Many middle-aged people fall into a deep sense of frustration when they realize this, but Hollis reminds us that the positive way is to ask ourselves on the premise of acknowledging reality: so, what else can I do? This question can also be asked in another way: who am I besides my past and the roles I play? Jung's psychology has a theory that divides a person's life into 4 stages. In these 4 stages, the core relationships we need to deal with are different. In the childhood stage, the core relationship is the parent-child relationship. When we enter the youth stage, the core relationship shifts to the self and the world. This is the stage where we, under the guidance of heroic thinking, strive to take action and try to achieve self-realization in secular life. When we reach the 3rd stage, that is, after we embark on the middle passage, the core relationship connects the self and the self. In the 4th stage, the axis shifts to the self and the universe. Let's not discuss the 4th stage that is not much involved in this book. We just mentioned a word, the self, which is a very important but quite confusing concept in Jung's psychology. Even Hollis, a senior Jungian analyst, admits in the book that the self is a mystery we will never understand. However, we can still roughly grasp this concept. The so-called self refers to the spiritual core we are born with, which runs through our lives and guides us to the meaning of life. You can also imagine it as a real self hiding deep in your heart. In the first half of our lives, the self is suppressed by our various desires and the requirements of various social cultures. It is not until the midpoint of life, when the temporary personality is loosened under the impact of anxiety, that the self has the opportunity to re-emerge. In Hollis's view, the most important task on the middle passage is to rediscover ourself. In this process of connecting the self and the self, we also move from the temporary personality to true adulthood, from the false self to the real self. So, what can we do specifically? Hollis writes in the book that the most important thing is to be alone. The being alone mentioned here is not simply staying away from people and living alone. It also corresponds to a specific concept in Jung's psychology, which is directly translated as exchange of views, Auseinandersetzung. This exchange of views is a bit like the back-and-forth conversation between a psychotherapist and his client, analyzing the inner world, but this conversation is between us and ourselves, or between the self and the self. To carry out this dialogue, all we need to do is to stay alone in a quiet space, try to listen to our inner feelings, and analyze the reasons for these feelings. This may not sound difficult, but in reality, it requires us to face our true selves with considerable courage and practice self-discipline to make this dialogue a daily exercise. When you first try, you may feel confused and not notice what feelings emerge in your heart. At this time, you just need to wait quietly until the moment Hollis said, when the dark begins to shine, and when silence begins to speak. Of course, this is not some mystical religious ceremony. It is just a form of self-psychological counseling to help us maintain the necessary connection with our inner selves every day. Will this inward exploration alienate our relationships with others? Hollis believes that the opposite is true. The more complete our self-development, the richer our interpersonal relationships will be. Jung's psychology has always emphasized that an individual's existence is based on collective relationships. Therefore, when a person becomes more aware of themselves, they will inevitably gain more social connections from others. There is an interesting paradox in the process of middle-aged people exploring their inner world. The best thing we can do for our partners and children is to develop ourselves and not become overly dependent on them. Similarly, the best way to serve the community is to become as complete and independent an individual as possible. If society is a huge puzzle, then each piece contributes to the whole picture because of its unique colors. The best way we can help others is to live our lives awake, so that others can live their lives freely. Conclusion. Well, here, we have understood the core content of the book The Middle Passage together, and next, let's make a brief summary. The Middle Passage is a work by the Jungian psychologist James Hollis, discussing the issue of midlife crisis. Hollis believes that the concept of midlife crisis is somewhat negative, and he prefers to call this midlife journey the Middle Passage, which is a passage connecting the past temporary personality and the future refined personality. Hollis describes the general process of personality formation in the book. In childhood, our memories of trauma form a naive self, known in psychoanalysis as the inner child. To protect this inner child, we adopt a series of strategies under the guidance of self-centered magical thinking to deal with the setbacks in life. This set of strategies forms our temporary personality. After growing up and entering society, the temporary personality projects an active and enterprising heroic thinking to the world, allowing us to find our self-worth in secular life. However, when heroic thinking encounters the limitations of reality, the midlife crisis also arrives. After magical thinking and heroic thinking, our way of thinking will switch to rational realistic thinking, and start learning to get along with the world with a humble attitude. In this stage, the core issue we face is to establish a connection between the self and the self. Having high-quality dialogues with ourselves in solitude will help us explore the self and find an anchor point of inner stability in the challenges of middle-aged life. At the beginning of this book, Hollis quotes a sentence from the diary of the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard: "Life is recollected backward, but it must be lived forward." In Hollis's view, this is also the attitude we should have when facing the midlife crisis. He writes, "The experience of the middle passage is like waking up to find oneself alone on a tossing ship, with no harbor in sight. At this moment, the only feasible choice is to hold the helm and continue sailing."